Oliver Twist, Chapter 5. Wrongs Are Righted. Word of the murder spread across London fast, and soon both the police and the general public could think of nothing other than catching the monster who had committed the crime. With nowhere else to hide, Bill returned to Fagin's room, where his sanity seemed to deteriorate by the hour, as if he were haunted by what he had done. It was Charlie Bates who gave them up. Witnessing Dodger getting sentenced to be transported to Australia, followed up by the sight of Nancy's corpse, had broken any bond of loyalty that Charlie felt to Fagin and Bill. When Bill heard the shouts of the police outside, he was up on the roof of the building in a flash. There was a great cry from the street as he was seen leaping from one roof to the next. A number of police officers entered Fagin's room and arrested the old man and the boys, while several others, roared on by an angry mob, tracked Bill's progress across the rooftops. Charlie was with the mob, and if Nancy's death had horrified him, he was far less concerned when he saw Bill make one leap too many and disappear between two buildings. Bill's sights gave a short scream as he fell, and it was the last sound he ever made. Nancy and Bill Sykes were both dead. Fagin and the gang of pickpockets were in captivity, and Oliver Twist was finally safe. He sat in a carriage with Rose Maylie, her aunt, Mr. Brownlow, and a sullen-looking young gentleman who never said a word. Mr. Brownlow had announced they were to visit Oliver's hometown to establish a few facts about Oliver's history that he thought the boy might find interesting. Despite all that had befallen him at the workhouse and then at Sowerbury, the undertaker's, Oliver was full of nervous excitement, and as he began to recognise the hedges and lanes he had travelled when he fled to London, he struck up a breathless commentary on the landscape. As they approached the town and then drove through its narrow streets, it was all his fellow passengers could do to prevent Oliver leaping out of the carriage. There was Sowerbury's, the undertaker's, just as it used to be, only smaller than he remembered it. There were all the well-known shops and houses. There was the workhouse with its gloomy windows frowning on the street. There was nearly everything as if he had left it yesterday, and all his recent life had been but a happy dream. They drove straight to the door of the best hotel in town, and were soon seated around a table inside, as Mr. Brownlow called the meeting order and produced a bundle of papers. "Oliver," began Mr. Brownlow kindly, "you're about to learn a good deal about your past, about your parents, and about why some of the events of the past few weeks have occurred. The first thing that you need to know," Brownlow continued, gesturing at the sullen gentleman from the carriage, "is that this fellow here is your half-brother. The second thing you need to know is that he has schemed and plotted against you for some time. We're here to put a stop to that." Oliver's mouth hung open. He felt as if his whole life, his whole world, was spinning round this very moment. Monks, that is what he's been calling himself. Monks here is now going to explain everything that he has done in relation to Oliver, and if he does not, then he'll be handed over to the police. Now, Monks, speak. With the utmost reluctance, Monks began his story. He told of how his father and mother had separated. He told of how his father had fallen in love again with a beautiful young woman named Agnes, who had become pregnant just before his father's sudden and untimely death. He told of how Agnes had been left with no money and how she had given birth in a workhouse. "Is he talking about my mother?" Oliver interrupted, very quietly. Mr. Brownlow nodded, and Monks continued. "I wanted to prevent you from ever finding out who your mother was," he said, not looking at Oliver, "because I wanted to keep all of our father's money. He left a will, leaving his money to you and your mother, but I destroyed it. Then I paid Fagin to get you into trouble with the law, thinking that you'd be sent to Australia." "Your father's will is the first thing we'll put right," said Brownlow. "Monks here has signed papers before witnesses transferring all of your father's remaining wealth to you, Oliver." Not for the first time, Oliver was too stunned to speak. Rose squeezed his hand gently. "How did you find all this out, Mr. Brownlow?" she asked. "By remarkable coincidence. Oliver's father was a very close friend of mine, and it so happened that he confided in me before his death. He also gave me a portrait of Agnes, your mother, Oliver, which now hangs in my study. When I saw you next to the portrait, it struck me as possible that you might be her child. Your story and your age supported the theory. And when Rose and I learned from Nancy, God rest her soul, that there was a young man in London seeking to remove all traces of Oliver's identity, it seemed to me quite likely that the young man might be my friend's son from his failed marriage. I tracked him down and mentioned that I had information about Oliver, and he came readily enough. Then I presented him with my accusations and offered him a choice, that we involve the police or that he give up his wrongful claims to his father's money and confess us all to us here. And that is how the last of Oliver's enemies was defeated. Monks left, never to return. Oliver is able to learn all about his mother and father and Rose. Yes, there is one more thing that must be told before the story is complete. Mrs. Maylie made a revelation of her own. Agnes, Oliver's mother, left behind a younger sister when she died by the name of Rose. Rose was only a few years old at the time, and when her parents then also died and left her an orphan, she was adopted as a niece by one Mrs. Maylie. On learning that they were, in fact, aunt and nephew, Rose and Oliver wept for joy and swore they would remain close together as long as they lived. Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver and they moved to live in the same village as the Maylies, so that Oliver's youthful years from that time on were so happy as to almost make amends for the years of suffering that came before. The end.